Good morning, I'm Stacey Delicat. Thanks so much for being with us here on Law and Crime on this Thursday, September 26th. It is another big day here on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Day 4 in the murder trial of former Dallas police officer Amber Guyger, who shot and killed 26-year-old Botham Jean in his own apartment last September. Guyger says she mistakenly entered his apartment thinking it was hers and thought he was an intruder. All right, and joining me this morning live, Cheryl Dorsey, retired LAPD sergeant, and Terry Austin, an attorney, both ladies joining me via Skype this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
And this is great because we have two different perspectives. Cheryl having been in law enforcement, Terry being an attorney, so we can talk this out. So ladies, I want to just quickly talk about yesterday. I recap what we heard in court. We heard about those neighbors testifying. They too have mistakenly tried to get in the wrong apartment before. Apparently, hallways in this building a little bit confusing. The floor number is pretty small. It could be hard to see the apartment number. Let me start with you, Terry. How do you think that testimony played? Does it make a big difference one way or the other?
I do think it makes a big difference, Stacey, if you mistakenly open the door and you see someone in the apartment and you believe it's your apartment. I think the question here is, after that, did she take the right action? Was she correct in shooting someone without giving that individual an opportunity to speak or stand down or do something other than shoot twice and ultimately kill him?
You know, that really, right, is at the heart of this trial. And now, Cheryl, let me ask you, because other law enforcement officers, other officers who responded to the scene have been questioned about this already. What is the right protocol to take in that situation? She's not on duty. She's technically a civilian at that point, right? Heading home. She opens the door. She sees someone strange. Should she have tried to just take cover and get out of the way? What should she have done?
Technically, she was a civilian in that she was off duty. But listen, you cannot unlearn, you cannot unknow police training. It is in our DNA. And so the appropriate action would have been to identify that target, assess whether or not you have a real threat, and then start going through the various options that you have available to you to deal with that threat. She had a taser. She could have easily, if he was advancing as they purport, tasered him before she jumped to deadly force. It was out of policy as far as I'm concerned.
Should she have announced herself? Should she have said, police, put your hands up? And as far as we know, she saw him and she fired the shot.
Well, listen, she doesn't have to identify herself as police because she's at home in her mind, right? But you would normally, reasonably, and that's the whole crux of this, reasonable. What's reasonable? You would have something to say, hey, what are you doing? This is my place. What's going on? You would articulate something to the person. You wouldn't just jump to shooting without having some kind of conversation. And allegedly, she was giving demands or commands that Bo wasn't responding to. What were those commands? And again, why lethal force as a first resort? That's not how we're taught. You use that as a last resort when you've tried everything else and that doesn't work.
Now, the lead investigator on this case, David Armstrong, who the judge and attorneys the courtroom heard from, who we heard from, but who jurors did not hear from, was pretty clear that he thinks she had a right to reasonably fear for her life. Now, the fact that we've heard that testimony, I mean, Terry, does it really make a difference if the jury hasn't heard it, though?
That's exactly right. The jury's going to have to determine on their own whether or not this was a crime. And I do understand why the judge might have made that decision. But I think the jury is going to need more information here as to whether or not when she went in that room, was it manslaughter? Was it murder? Was it negligent homicide? And I think they're going to need more facts to determine which of the three. I think it's pretty clear that she did not go to the apartment with the intent to kill anyone, because clearly there's no connection between her and the victim. But now I think the jury's going to have to determine whether or not she was reckless or whether or not this was just negligence. And the difference is slight, but one is a total disregard and the other is, this was truly an accident. That's what the jury is going to have to figure out here.
Yes, clearly, for sure, and there are a lot of nuances in that. And I'm just curious, Cheryl, you gave us your point of view already. She could have used the taser. She didn't have to kill this guy. What did you think, as a former law enforcement officer yourself, hearing the Texas Ranger, the lead investigator on this case, testifying and saying that he believed that she was justified, essentially, that no crime had been committed because she should have reasonably feared for her life. I mean, what was your thought hearing a fellow member of law enforcement say that?
Well, listen, I'm not only an officer, I'm a supervisor, I'm a sergeant. And what he said was outrageous and ridiculous. He has no credibility because at the end of the day, understand, he's the lead investigator, and I have acted in the capacity of a case-carrying detective. So I know that it was his responsibility to put together the package, the case, to present to the district attorney. So how, on the one hand, can he be the person responsible for gathering all of this information, writing it down, putting it together, taking it over to the DA, presenting it in a concise, clear manner, sufficient enough to get an arrest warrant, and then come to court and say she should have never been arrested, there was no probable cause? He lacks credibility.
And, you know, one could say, oh, well, he's just trying to cover for his subordinate, but Amber Guyger isn't really his subordinate. I mean, they're from different departments. She's with the Dallas Police Department. He's a Texas Ranger. Still, I could see many people saying, you know, he's just trying to stick up for his fellow law enforcement officers. Well, speaking of law enforcement officers, let's go back to some testimony from Officer Michael Lee. He was one of the first officers to respond to the scene that night. Let's listen to what he testified. Well, there you have it. A fellow officer of Guyger's testifying that his training has taught him that he would first take cover. He wouldn't shoot him and see what happens after, the way the prosecutor posed it. So this was testimony that the jury did hear versus the supervisor yesterday. They did not hear. Terry, you know, this is basically, right, other expert testimony then from law enforcement say this is how we're trained to act. Will this, you think, sway jurors?
That's exactly right. I think it is testimony the jurors needed to hear. I think it's going to help them determine what was the proper course of action. I think he was a great witness. He was very, you know, credible. And I think the jury is going to put themselves in the place of the police officer, in the place of the defendant, and think she should have done what the protocol was, which is to stop, take cover, wait for backup, and to at least assess the situation before going in and just shooting and killing the individual.
You know, another question I think a lot of people have about what protocol was, we heard Officer Lee talk about trying to revive John with his fellow officer when they arrived at the scene. What about Amber Guyger, Cheryl? Should she have immediately gone to him and tried to render aid, or are there sort of specific guidelines in this case since she's the one who opened fire? I mean, presumably, right, she's the only one there for the first few minutes until the first responders arrive. Should she have tried to save his life herself?
Well, listen, let's just take protocol and procedure out of it, just as a human, right? Just from one person to another. Where's your humanity? You shot someone, and now he may possibly be dying in front of you, and you don't even make an attempt to render some sort of aid. And so, listen, absolutely she should have jumped in and did something. She had time to get on the phone and call her boyfriend. She had time to text her boyfriend while she was talking to 911. She did everything, but show her humanity, show some compassion for this man. It's off-putting.
You bring up the text, the phone calls with her boyfriend, her partner in the police department, whom she'd been having a romantic relationship. I want to talk about that a little more, but first, going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.